The Secret Doctrine by Elena Petrovna Blavatsky, a facsimile of the original edition of 1888, printed by the Cunningham Press, Alhambra, California. Book 2, Part 1, Anthropogenesis, stanzas translated with commentaries, from the Secret Book of John. Stanza 10 continued. The races with the third eye. The subject is so unusual, the path pursued so intricate, so full of dangerous pitfalls prepared by adverse theories and criticism, that good reasons have to be given for every step taken. While turning the light of the bull's eye, called esotericism, on almost every inch of the occult grounds travelled over, we have also to use its lens to throw into stronger objectivity the regions explored by exact science. This not only in order to contrast the two, but to defend our position. Note: for suggestiveness, we would recommend a short article in the Theosophist of August 1887, Esoteric Studies. Its author expounds therein quite an occult theory, though to the world a new idea, the progress of the monad concurring with the retrogression of form, 666, that is, with a decrease of the V formativa. He says, who knows what shape vehicled the ego in remote rings, rounds or races? May not man's type have been that of the Simidae in its variety? Might not the monkey kingdom of Ramayana frame rest on some far-off tradition relating to a period when there was a common lot, or rather aspect, of man? And winds up a very clever, though too short, exposition of his theory by saying that, which every true occultist will endorse, quote, with physico-ethereal man there must be involution of sex. As physico-astral man depended on entities of the subhuman class evolved from animal prototypes for rebirth, so will physico-ethereal man find among the graceful, shapely orders issuing from the air plane one or more which will be developed for his successive embodiments when procreated forms are given, a process which will include all mankind only very gradually. The Adamic and post-Adamic races were giants. Their ethereal counterparts may possibly be Lilliputians, beauteous, luminous, diaphanous, but will assuredly be giants in mind, unquote. Page 671, article by Visconti de Figarières, FTS. End of note. It may be complained by some that too little is said of the physical, human side of the extinct races in this history of their growth and evolution. Much more might be said assuredly, if simple prudence did not make us hesitate at the threshold of every new revelation. That which finds its possibility and landmarks in the discoveries of modern science is given, or that of which exact knowledge knows nothing and upon which it is unable to speculate, and therefore denies as facts in nature, is withheld. But even such statements as these, for example, that of all the mammalians man was the earliest, that it is man who is the indirect ancestor of the ape, and that he was a kind of a Cyclops in days of old, will all be contested. Yet the scientists will never be able to prove except to their own satisfaction that it was not so. Nor can they admit that the first two races of men were too ethereal and phantom-like in their constitution, organism, and shape, even to be called physical man. For if they do, it will be found that this is one of the reasons why their relics can never be expected to be exhumed among other fossils. Nevertheless, all this is maintained. Man was the storehouse, so to speak, of all the seeds of life for this round, vegetable and animal alike. Note: it may be objected that this is a contradiction, that, as the first root race appeared 300 million years after the vegetation had evolved, the seed of vegetable life could not be in the first race. We say it could, for up to man's appearance in this round, the vegetation was of quite another kind than it is now, and quite ethereal. This for the simple reason that no grass or plants could have been physical before there were animal or other organisms to breathe out the carbonic acid which vegetation has to imbibe for its development, its nutrition and growth. They are interdependent in their physical and achieved forms. End of note. As Ein Sof is one notwithstanding the innumerable forms which are in him, Zohar 1:21a, so is man on earth the microcosm of the macrocosm. As soon as man appeared, everything was complete, for everything is comprised in man. He unites in himself all forms. Zohar 3:48a. The mystery of the earthly man is after the mystery of the heavenly man. Zohar 2:76a. The human form, so called because it is the vehicle under whatever shape of the divine man, is, as so intuitionally remarked by the author of esoteric studies, the new type at the beginning of every round. As man never can be, so he never has been, manifested in a shape belonging to the animal kingdom in esse. The author proceeds, he never formed part of that kingdom, only derived from the most finished class of the latter. A new human form must always have been the new type of the cycle. The human shape in one ring, within brackets question mark, as I imagine, becomes cast-off clothes in the next. It is then appropriated by the highest order in the servant kingdom below." Unquote. If the idea is what we understand it to mean, for the rings spoken of throw some confusion upon it, then it is the correct esoteric teaching. Having appeared at the very beginning, and at the head of sentient and conscious life, man, the astral, the soul for the Zohar, repeating the archaic teaching, distinctly says that the real man is the soul, and his material frame no part of him. Man becomes the living and animal unit from which the cast-off clothes determined the shape of every life and animal in this round. Note, it is stated in the Zohar that the primordial worlds, sparks, could not continue because man was not as yet. The human form contains everything, and as it did not as yet exist, the worlds were destroyed, it says. End of note. Thus he created 4 ages, the insects, reptiles, birds, and animals unconsciously to himself, from his remains and relics from the 3rd and the 4th rounds. The same idea and teaching are as distinctly given in the Vendidad of the Mazdeans, as they are in the Chaldean and the Mosaic allegory of the Ark, all of which are the many national versions of the original legend given in the Hindu scriptures. It is found in the allegory of Vaivashvata Manu and his ark with the 7 rishis, as in that of the rishis, each of whom is shown the father and progenitor of specified animals, reptiles, and even monsters. See Vishnu and other Puranas. Open the Mazdean Vendidad at Fargod 2 at verse 27-73, and read the command of Ormuzd to Yima, a spirit of the earth, who symbolizes the 3 races, after telling him to build a vara, an enclosure, an argua or vehicle. Quote, "Thither into the vara thou shalt bring the seeds of men and women, of the greatest, best, and finest kinds on this earth. Thither thou shalt bring the seeds of every kind of cattle," etc., etc. And verse 28-74, "All those seeds shalt thou bring, to every kind, to be kept inexhaustible there, so long as those men shall stay in the vara." Unquote. Those men in the vara are the progenitors, the heavenly men or dhyani, the future egos who are commissioned to inform mankind. For vara, or the ark, or again the vehicle, simply means man. Note, this is the meaning when the allegory and symbol are opened and read by means by the human key, or the key to terrestrial anthroposophy. This interpretation of the ark symbolism does not in the least interfere with its astronomical or even theogonic keys, nor with any of the other 6 meanings. Nor does it seem less scientific that the modern theories about the origin of man. As said, it has 7 keys to it, like the rest. End of note. Verse 30 says, "Thou shalt seal up the vara after filling it up with the seeds, and thou shalt make a door and a window self-shining within, which is the soul." And when Yima inquires of Ahura Mazda how he shall manage to make that vara, he is answered, "Crush the earth and knead it with thy hands, as the potter does when kneading the potter's clay." Verse 31. The Egyptian ram-headed god makes man of clay on a potter's wheel, and so in Genesis do the Elohim fashion him out of the same material. When the maker of the material world, Ahura Mazda, is asked, furthermore, what is it to give light to the vara which Yima made, he is told that there are uncreated lights and created lights, and that there, in Ariana Vego, where Vara is built, the stars, the moon, and the sun are only once a year seen to rise and set, and a year seems only as a day and night, a clear reference to the land of the gods, or the now polar regions. Moreover, another hint is contained in this verse, a distinct allusion to the uncredited lights which enlighten man within, his principles. Otherwise no sense or reason could be found in Ahura Mazda's answer, which is forthwith followed by verse 41, saying that every 40th year to every couple, hermaphrodite, 2 are born, a male and female, the latter being a distinct echo of the secret doctrine of a stanza which says, "At the expiration of every 40 annual suns, at the end of every 40th day, the double one becomes 4, male and female in one, in the first and second and the third," which is clear since every sun meant a whole year, the latter being composed of 1 day then, as in the Arctic Circle, as it is now composed of 6 months. According to the old teaching, the axis of the earth gradually changes its inclination to the ecliptic, and at the period referred to this inclination was such that a polar day lasted during the whole period of the earth's revolution about the sun, when a kind of twilight of very short duration intervened, after which the polar land resumed its position directly under the solar rays. This may be contrary to astronomy as now taught and understood, but who can say that changes in the motion of the earth which do not take place now did not occur millions of years back? Returning once more to the statement that Vara meant the man of the 4th round as much as the earth of those days, the moon, and even Noah's Ark, if one will so have it, this is again shown in the dialogue between Ahura Mazda and Zarathustra. First, when the latter asks in verse 42, "O maker of the material world, thou Holy One, who is he who brought the law of Mazda into the Vara which Yima made?" Ahura Mazda answered, "It was the bird Karshipta, O holy Zarathustra. The bird Karshipta dwells in the heavens, were he living on the earth he would be king of birds. He brought into the Vara of Yima and recites the Avesta in the language of birds." This again is an allegory and a symbol misunderstood by the Orientalists only, who see in this bird an incarnation of lightning, and say its song was often taught to be the utterance of a god and a revelation, and what not. Karshipta is the human mind-soul, and the deity thereof symbolized in ancient Magianism by a bird, as the Greeks symbolized it by a butterfly. No sooner had Karshipta entered the Vara, or man, than he understood the law of Mazda, or divine wisdom. In the book of Concealed Mystery it is said of the tree, which is the tree of knowledge of good and evil, "In its branches of the tree the birds lodge and build their nests, or the souls and the angels have their place." Note, see Kabbalah Unveiled by S. MacGregor Mathis, page 104, end of note. Therefore, with the Kabbalists it was like a symbol. Bird was a Chaldean, and has become a Hebrew synonym and symbol for angel, a soul, a spirit, or deva, and the bird's nest was with both heaven and is God's bosom in the Zohar. The perfect Messiah enters Eden into that place which is called the bird's nest, from Zohar 2:8b. Like a bird that is flying from its nest, and that is the soul from which the Shekinah, divine wisdom or grace, does not move away. Zohar 3:278a, and Meir's Kabbalah 217. The nest of eternal bird, the flutter of whose wings produces life, is boundless space, says the commentary meaning Hansa, the bird of wisdom. It is Adam Kadmon who is the Sephirothal tree, and it is he who becomes the tree of knowledge of good and evil esoterically. And that tree hath around it 7 columns, 7 pillars of the world, or rectores, the same progenitors, or Sephiroth again, operating through the respective orders of angels in the spheres of the 7 planets, etc., one of which orders begets giants, Nephilim, on earth. It was the belief of entire antiquity, pagan and Christian, that the earliest mankind was a race of giants. Certain excavations in America, in mounds and in caves, have already yielded in isolated cases groups of skeletons of 9 and 12 feet high. Note: Darwinian evolutionists who are so wont to refer to the evidence of reversion to type, the full meaning of which in the case of human masters is embraced in the esoteric solution of the embryological problem, as proof of their arguments, would do well to inquire into those instances of modern giants who are often 8, 9, and 11 feet high. Such reversions are imperfect yet undeniably reproductions of the original towering man of primeval times. End of note. These belong to tribes of the early fifth race, now degenerated to an average size of between 5 and 6 feet. But we can easily believe that the Titans and Cyclops of old really belonged to the fourth Atlantean race, and that all the subsequent legends and allegories found in the Hindu Puranas and the Greek Hesiod and Homer were based on the hazy reminiscences of real Titans, men of a superhuman, tremendous physical power which enabled them to defend themselves and hold at bay the gigantic monsters of the Mesozoic and earlier Cenozoic times, and of actual Cyclops, three-eyed mortals. It has been often remarked by observant writers that the origin of nearly every popular myth and legend could be traced invariably to a fact in nature. In these fantastic creations of an exuberant subjectivism, there is always an element of the objective and real. The imagination of the masses, disorderly and ill-regulated as it may be, could never have conceived and fabricated ex nihilo so many monstrous figures, such a wealth of extraordinary tales, had it not had to serve it as a central nucleus those floating reminiscences, obscure and vague, which unite the broken links of the chain of time to form with them the mysterious dream foundation of our collective consciousness. Note: see Mythical Monsters by Gould, from whose interesting and scientific volume a few passages are quoted further on. See in Mr. Sinnett's Occult World the description of a cavern in the Himalayan filled with relics of human and animal giant bones. End of note. The evidence for the Cyclops, a race of giants, will be pointed out in forthcoming sections, in the Cyclopean remnant so-called to this day. An indication that during its evolution and before the final adjustment of the human organism, which became perfect and symmetrical only in the fifth race, the early fourth race may have been third-eyed without having necessarily a third eye in the middle of the brow, like the legendary Cyclops, is also furnished by science. To the occultists who believe that spiritual and psychic involution proceeds on parallel lines with physical evolution, that the inner senses, innate in the first human races, atrophied during racial growth and the material development of the outer senses. To the student of esoteric symbology, finally, this statement is no conjecture or possibility, but simply a phase of the law of growth, a proven fact, in short. They understand the meaning of this passage in the commentaries, which says, "There were four-armed human creatures in those early days of the male-females, hermaphrodites, with one head yet 3 eyes. They could see before them and behind them." Note, meaning the third eye was at the back of the head. The statement of the latest hermaphrodite humanity was four-armed unriddles probably the mystery of all the representations and idols of the exoteric gods of India. On the Acropolis of Argos there was a rudely carved wooden statue attributed to Daedalus, representing a three-eyed colossus, which was consecrated to Zeus, Triopas, three-eyed. The head of the quote god unquote has 2 eyes in its face and one above on top of the forehead. It is considered the most archaic of all the ancient statues. End of note. A kalpa later, after the separation of the sexes, men having fallen into matter, their spiritual vision became dim, and coordinately the third eye commenced to lose its power. When the fourth race arrived at its middle age, the inner vision had to be awakened and acquired by artificial stimuli, the process of which was known to the old sages. Note: the inner sight could henceforth be acquired only through training and initiation, save in the case of natural and born magicians, sensitives and mediums, as they are called now. End of note. The third eye, likewise, getting gradually petrified, soon disappeared. Note: this expression petrified instead of ossified is curious. The back eye, which is of course the pineal gland now so called, the small pea-like mass of grey nervous matter attached to the back of the third ventricle of the brain, is said to almost invariably contain mineral concretions and sand, and nothing more. Vide info. End of note. The double-faced became the one-faced, and the eye was drawn deep into the head, and is now buried under the hair. During the activity of the inner man, during trances and spiritual visions, the eye swells and expands. The Arhat sees and feels it, and regulates his action accordingly. The undefiled Lanu, disciple of Chela, need fear no danger. He who keeps himself not in purity, who is not chaste, will receive no help from the Deva. Unquote. Unfortunately not. The, quote, Deva eye, unquote, exists no more for the majority of mankind. The third eye is dead and acts no longer, but it has left behind a witness to its existence. The witness is now the pineal gland. As for the four-armed men, it is they who become the prototypes of the four-armed Hindu gods, as shown in the preceding footnote. Such is the mystery of the human eye that, in their vain endeavors to explain and account for all the difficulties surrounding its action, some scientists have been forced to resort to occult explanations. The development of the human eye gives more support to the occult anthropology than to that of the materialistic physiologists. The eyes in the human embryo grow from without, out of the brain, instead of being part of the skin, as in the insects and cuttlefish. Professor Lancaster, thinking the brain a queer place for the eye, and attempting to explain the phenomenon on Darwinian lines, suggests the curious view that our earliest vertebrate ancestor was a transparent creature, and hence did not mind where the eye was. And so was man a transparent creature once upon a time, we are taught, hence our theory holds good. But how does the Lancaster hypothesis square with the Haeckel's view that the vertebrate eye originated by changes in the epidermis? If it started inside, the theory goes into the wastebasket. This seems to be proved by embryology. Moreover, Professor Lancaster's extraordinary suggestion, or shall we say admission, is rendered perhaps necessary by evolutionist necessities. Occultism, with its teaching as to the gradual development of senses from within without, from astral prototypes, is far more satisfactory. The third eye retreated inwards when its course was run, another point in favor of occultism. The allegorical expression of the Hindu mystics when speaking of the eye of Shiva, the Tribokana, three-eyed, thus receives its justification and raison d'être, the transference of the pineal gland, once that third eye, to the forehead, being an exoteric license. This throws also light on the mystery, incomprehensible to some, of the connection between abnormal or spiritual seership and the physiological purity of the seer. The question is often asked, why should celibacy and chastity be a sine qua non rule and condition of regular chelatship, or the development of psychic and occult powers? The answer is contained in the commentary. When we learn that the third eye was once a physiological organ, and later on owing to the gradual disappearance of spirituality and increase of materiality, spiritual nature being extinguished by the physical, it became an atrophied organ, as little understood now by physiologists as the spleen is. When we learn this, the connection will become clearer. During human life, the greatest impediment in the way of spiritual development, and especially to the acquirement of yoga powers, is the activity of our physiological senses. Sexual action being closely connected by interaction with the spinal cord and the grey matter of the brain, it is useless to give any longer explanation. Of course, the normal and abnormal state of the brain and the degree of active work in the medulla oblongata reacts powerfully on the pineal gland, for owing to the number of, quote, centers, unquote, in that region, which controls by far the greater majority of the physiological reactions of the animal economy, and also owing to the close and intimate neighborhood of the two, there must be exerted a very powerful, quote, inductive, unquote, action by the medulla on the pineal gland. All this is quite plain to the occultist, but is very vague in the sight of the general reader. The latter must then be shown the possibility of a three-eyed man in nature in those periods, yet in a comparatively chaotic state. Such a possibility may be inferred from anatomical and zoological knowledge, first of all, then it may rest on the assumptions of materialistic science itself. It is asserted upon the authority of science and upon evidence, which is not merely a fiction of theoretical speculation this time, that many of the animals, especially among the lower orders of the vertebrae, have a third eye, now atrophied, but necessarily active in its origin. Note: deeply placed within the head, covered by thick skin and muscles, true eyes that cannot see are found in certain animals. Also, says Haeckel, vertebrae, blind moles and field mice, blind snakes and lizards. They shun daylight, dwelling under the ground. They were not originally blind, but have evolved from ancestors that lived in the light and had well-developed eyes. The atrophied eye beneath the opaque skin may be found in these blind beings in every stage of reversion. Unquote from Sense Organs by Haeckel. And if two eyes could become so atrophied in low animals, why not one eye, the pineal gland, in man, who is but a higher animal in his physical aspect? End of note. The Hateria species, a lizard of the order Lacatilia, recently discovered in New Zealand, a part of ancient Lemuria so-called, mark well, presents this peculiarity in a most extraordinary manner, and not only the Hateria punctata, but the chameleon, certain reptiles, and even fishes. It was thought at first that it was no more than the prolongation of the brain ending with a small protuberance called epiphysis, a little bone separated from the main bone by cartilage and found in every animal. But it was soon found to be more than this. It offered, as its development and anatomical structure showed, such an analogy with that of the eye that it was found impossible to see in it anything else. There were and are paleontologists who feel convinced to this day that this, quote, third eye, unquote, has functioned in its origin, and they are certainly right. For this is what is said of the pineal gland in Quain's Anatomy, Volume 2, 9th edition, pages 830 to 851. Thalamencephalon, interbrain. Quote, it is from this part, constituting at first the whole and subsequently the hinder part of the anterior primary encephalic vesicle, that the optic vesicles are developed in the earliest period, and the forepart is that in connection which the cerebral hemispheres and accompanying parts are formed. The thalamus opticus of each side is formed by a lateral thickening of the medullary wall, while the interval between, descending towards the base, constitutes the cavity of the third ventricle with its prolongation in the infundibulum. The grey commissure afterwards stretches across the ventricular cavity. The hinder part of the roof is developed by a peculiar process, to be noticed later, into the pineal gland, which remains united on each side by its pedicles, and behind these a transverse band is formed as posterior commissure. The lamina terminalis, lamina cinerea, continues to close the third ventricle in front. Below it, the optic commissure forms the floor of the ventricle, and further back, the infundibulum descends to be united in the sella turcica with the tissue adjoining the posterior lobe of the pituitary body. The two optic thalami formed from the posterior and the outer part of the anterior vesicle consist at first of a single hollow sac of nervous matter, the cavity of which communicates on each side in front with that of the commencing cerebral hemispheres, and behind with that of the middle cephalic vesicle, corpora quadrigemina. Soon, however, by increased deposits taking place in the anterior, behind, below, and at the sides, the thalami became solid, and at the same time a cleft or fissure appears between them above, and penetrates down to the internal cavity, which continues open at the back part opposite the entrance of the Sylvian aqueduct. This cleft or fissure is the third ventricle. Behind, the two thalami continue united by the posterior commissure, which is distinguishable about the end of the third month, and also by the peduncles of the pineal gland. At an early period, the optic tract, may be recognized as hollow prolongations from the outer part of the wall of the thalami while they are still vesicular. At the 4th month, these tracts are distinctly formed. They subsequently are prolonged backwards into connection with the corpora quadrigemina. The formation of the pineal gland and pituitary body presents some of the most interesting phenomena which are connected with the development of the thalamencephalon." Unquote. The above is especially interesting when it is remembered that, were it not for the development of the hinder part of the cerebral hemispheres backwards, the pineal gland would be perfectly visible on the removal of the parietal bones. It is very interesting also to note the obvious connection to be traced between the originally hollow optic tracts and the eyes anteriorly, the pineal gland, and its peduncles behind, and all these with the optic thalami, so that the recent discoveries in connection with the third eye of Hateria punctata have a very important bearing on the developmental history of the human senses and on the occult assertions in the text. It is well known, and also regarded as a fiction now by those who have ceased to believe in the existence of an immortal principle in man, that Descartes saw in the pineal gland the seat of the soul. Although it is joined to every part of the body, he said, there is one special portion of it in which the soul exercises its function more specially than in any other, and as neither the heart nor yet the brain could be that special locality, he concluded that it was that little gland tied to the brain, yet having an action independent of it, that it could easily be put into a kind of a swinging motion, quote, by the animal spirits, which cross the cavities of the skull in every sense, unquote. Note, the nervous ether of Dr. B. W. Richardson, FRS, the nerve aura of occultism, the animal spirits, within brackets question mark, are equivalent to the currents of the nerve auric compound circulation, end of note. Unscientific as this may appear in our day of exact learning, Descartes was yet far nearer the occult truth than is any Haeckel, for the pineal gland as shown is far more connected with the soul and spirit than with the physiological senses of man. Had the leading scientists a glimmer of the real processes employed by the evolutionary impulse and the widening cyclic course of this great law, they would know instead of conjecturing, and feel as certain of the future physical transformations of the human kind by their knowledge of its past forms. Then would they see the fallacy and all the absurdity of their modern blind force and mechanical processes of nature, realizing, in consequence of such knowledge, that the said pineal gland, for instance, could not but be disabled for physical use at this stage of our cycle. If the odd, quote, eye, unquote, in man is now atrophied, it is a proof that, as in the lower animal, it has once been active. For nature never creates the smallest, the most insignificant form without some definite purpose and use. It was an active organ, we say, at that stage of evolution when the spiritual element in man reigned supreme over the hardly nascent intellectual and psychic elements. And as the cycle ran down toward that point when the physiological senses were developed by and went pari passu with the growth and consolidation of the physical man, the interminable and complex vicissitudes and tribulations of zoological development, that median, quote, eye, unquote, ended by atrophying along with the early spiritual and purely psychic characteristics in man. The eye is the mirror and also the window of the soul, says popular wisdom, and vox populi, vox Dei. Note, let us remember that the first race is shown in occult sciences as spiritual within and ethereal without. The second, psycho-spiritual mentally and ethereal-physical bodily. The third, still bereft of intellect in its beginning, is astrophysical in its body, and lives an inner life in which the psycho-spiritual element is in no way interfered with as yet by the hardly nascent physiological senses. Its two front eyes look before them without seeing either past or future, but the, quote, third eye, unquote, embraces eternity. End of note. In the beginning, every class and family of living species was hermaphrodite and objectively one-eyed. In the animal, whose form was an ethereal, astrally, as that of man, before the bodies of both began to evolve their coats of skin, meaning to evolve from within, without the thick coating of physical substance or matter with its internal physiological mechanism. The third eye was primarily, as in man, the only seeing organ. The two physical front eyes developed later on in both brute and man, whose organ of physical sight was, at the commencement of the third race, in the same position as that of some of the blind vertebrae in our day, that is, beneath an opaque skin. Notes. But in a very different manner to that pictured by Haeckel as an evolution by natural selection in the struggle for existence. See Pedigree of Man, Sense Organs, page 335. The mere, quote, thermal sensibility of the skin, unquote, to hypothetical light waves is absurdly incompetent to account for the beautiful combination of adaptations present in the eye. It has, moreover, been previously shown that, quote, natural selection, unquote, is a pure myth when credited with the origination of variations, vide Info Part 3 on Darwinian mechanical causation, as the, quote, survival of the fittest, unquote, can only take place after useful variations have sprung up, together with the improved organisms. Whence came the, quote, useful variations, unquote, which developed the eye? Only from, quote, blind forces, without aim, without design, unquote. The argument is puerile. The true solution of the mystery is to be found in the impersonal divine wisdom, in its ideation, reflected through matter. And note, paleontology has ascertained that in the animals of the Cenozoic age, the saurians especially, such as the antediluvian labyrinthodon, whose fossil skull exhibits a perforation otherwise inexplicable, the third or odd eye must have been much developed. 7 naturalists, among others E. Korschelt, felt convinced that whereas, notwithstanding the opaque skin covering it, such an eye in the reptiles of the present period can only distinguish light from darkness, as the human eyes do when bound with a handkerchief, or even tightly closed. In the now extinct animals, that eye functioned and was a real organ of vision. End of notes. Only stages of the odd, or primeval eye, in man and brute, are now inverted, as the former has already passed that animal non-rational stage in the third round, and is ahead of mere brute creation by a whole plane of consciousness. Therefore, while the Cyclopean eye was, and still is, in man the origin of spiritual sight, in the animal it was that of objective vision, and this eye, having performed its function, was replaced in the course of physical evolution from the simple to the complex by 2 eyes, and thus was stored and laid aside by nature for further use in aeons to come. This explains why the pineal gland reached its highest development proportionately with the lowest physical development. It is the vertebrae in which it is the most prominent and objective, and in man it is most carefully hidden and inaccessible except to the anatomist. No less light is thrown thereby on the future physical, spiritual, and intellectual state of mankind, in periods corresponding on parallel lines with other past periods, and always on the lines of ascending and descending cyclic evolution and development. Thus, a few centuries before the Kali Yuga, the Black Age, which began nearly 5,000 years ago, it was said, paraphrased into comprehensive sentences, quote, we, the 5th foot race, in our first half of duration onward on the now ascending arc of the cycle, on the midpoint of or between the first and the second races, falling downward, that is, the races were then on the descending arc of the cycle. Calculate for thyself, Lanu, and see, unquote, from Commentary 20. Calculating as advised, we find that during that transitional period, namely in the second half of the first spiritual ethereal-astral race, nascent mankind was devoid of the intellectual brain element, as it was on its descending line, and as we are parallel to it on the ascending, we are, therefore, devoid of the spiritual element, which is now replaced by the intellectual. For remember well, as we are in the Manasa period of our cycle of races, or in the 5th, we have therefore crossed the meridian point of the perfect adjustment of spirit and matter, or that equilibrium between brain intellect and spiritual perception. One important point has, however, to be borne in mind. We are only in the 4th round, and it is in the fifth that the full development of Manus, as a direct ray from the universal Mahat, a ray unimpeded by matter, will be finally reached. Nevertheless, as every sub-race and nation have their cycles and stages of developmental evolution repeated on a smaller scale, it must be the more so in the case of a root race. Our race then has, as a root race, crossed the equatorial line and is cycling onward on the spiritual side. But some of our sub-races still find themselves on the shadowy descending arc of their respective national cycles, while others again, the oldest, having crossed their crucial point, which alone decides whether a race, a nation, or a tribe will live or perish, are at the apex of spiritual development as sub-races. It becomes comprehensible now why the odd eye has been gradually transformed into a simple gland after the physical fall of those we have agreed to call the Lemurians. It is a curious fact that it is especially in human beings that the cerebral hemispheres and the lateral ventricles have been developed, and that the optic thalami, corpora quadrigemina, and corpora striata are the principal parts which are developed in the mammalian brain. Moreover, it is asserted that the intellect of any man may to some extent be gauged by the development of the central convolutions and the forepart of the cerebral hemispheres. It would seem a natural corollary that if the development and increased size of the pineal gland may be considered to be an index of the astral capacities and spiritual proclivities of any man, there will be a corresponding development of that part of the cranium, or an increase in the size of the pineal gland, at the expense of the hinder part of the cerebral hemispheres. It is a curious speculation, which would receive a confirmation in this case. We should see, below and behind, the cerebellum, which has been held to be the seat of all the animal proclivities of a human being, and which is allowed by science to be the great center for all the physiologically coordinated movements of the body, such as walking, eating, etc., etc., in front, the forepart of the brain, the cerebral hemispheres, the part especially connected with the development of the intellectual powers in man, and in the middle, dominating them both, and especially the animal functions, the developed pineal gland in connection with the more highly evolved or spiritual man. It must be remembered that these are only physical correspondences, just as the ordinary human brain is the registering organ of memory, but not memory itself. This is, then, the organ which gave rise to so many legends and traditions, among others to that of man with one head but two faces. These may be found in several Chinese works, besides being referred to in the Chaldean fragments. Apart from the work already cited, the Chennai King, compiled by King Chia, from engravings on 9 urns made 2255 before Christ by the Emperor Yu, there may be found in another work called the Bamboo Books, and in a third one, the Raya, initiated according to the tradition by Chao Kung, uncle of Wu Wang, the first emperor of the Zhao dynasty, before Christ 1122, says Mr. Charles Gould in his Mythical Monsters. The Bamboo Books contain the ancient annals of China, found AD 279 at the opening of the grave of King Sheng of Wei, who died BC 295. Both these works mention men with 2 faces on one head, one in front and one behind, on page 27. Now that which the students of occultism ought to know is that the third eye is indissolubly connected with karma. The tenet is so mysterious that very few have heard of it. The eye of Shiva did not become entirely atrophied before the close of the 4th race, when spirituality and all the divine powers and attributes of the Devaman of the 3rd had been made the handmaidens of the newly awakened physiological and psychic passions of the physical man. Instead of the reverse, the eye lost its powers. But such was the law of evolution, and it was, in strict accuracy, no fall. The sin was not in using those newly developed powers, but in misusing them. In making of the tabernacle designed to contain a god, the fane of every spiritual iniquity. And if we say sin, it is merely that everyone should understand our meaning, as the term karma would be the right one to use in this case, while the reader who would feel perplexed at the use of the term spiritual instead of physical iniquity is reminded of the fact that there can be no physical iniquity. Note on karma. Karma is a word of many meanings and has a special term for almost every one of its aspects. It means, as a synonym of sin, the performance of some action for the attainment of an object of worldly, hence selfish, desire, which cannot fail to be hurtful to somebody else. Karman is action the cause, and karma again is the law of ethical causation, the effect of an act produced egoistically when the great law of harmony depends on altruism. End of note. The body is simply the irresponsible organ, the tool of the psychic, if not the spiritual man. While in the case of the Atlanteans, it was precisely the spiritual being which sinned, the spirit element being still the master principle in man in those days. Thus it is in those days that the heaviest karma of the fifth race was generated by our monads. As this sentence may again be found puzzling, it is better that it should be explained for the benefit of those who are ignorant of the theosophical teachings. Questions with regard to karma and rebirths are constantly offered, and a great confusion seems to exist upon this subject. Those who are born and bred in the Christian faith and have been trained in the idea that a new soul is created by God for every newly born infant are among the most perplexed. They ask whether in such case the number of incarnating monads on earth is limited, to which they are answered in the affirmative. For however countless in our conceptions the number of incarnating monads, even if we take into account the fact that ever since the second race, when their respective 7 groups were furnished with bodies, several births and deaths may be allowed for every second of time in the aeons already past, still there must be a limit. It was stated that karma nemesis, whose bondmaid is nature, adjusted everything in the most harmonious manner, and that therefore the fresh pouring in or arrival of new monads had ceased as soon as humanity had reached its full physical development. No fresh monads have incarnated since the middle point of the Atlanteans. Hence, remembering that, save in the case of young children, and of individuals whose lives were violently cut off by some accident, no spiritual entity can reincarnate before a period of many centuries has elapsed. Such gaps alone must show that the number of monads is necessarily finite and limited. Moreover, a reasonable time must be given to other animals for their evolutionary progress. Hence the assertion that many of us are now working off the effects of the evil karmic causes produced by us in Atlantean bodies. The law of karma is inextricably interwoven with that of reincarnation. It is only the knowledge of the constant rebirths of one and the same individuality throughout the life cycle, the assurance that the same monads, among whom are many Diancochans or the gods themselves, have to pass through the circle of necessity, rewarded or punished by such rebirth for the suffering endured or crimes committed in the former life, that those very monads which entered the empty, senseless shells or astral figures of the first rays emanated by the Pitris are the same who are now amongst us, nay, ourselves, perchance. It is only this doctrine, we say, that can explain to us the mysterious problem of good and evil, and reconcile man to the terrible and apparent injustice of life. Nothing but such certainty can quiet our revolted sense of justice, for when one acquainted with the noble doctrine looks around him and observes the inequalities of birth and fortune, of intellect and capacities, when one sees honor-paid fools and profligates, on whom fortune has heaped her favors by a mere privilege of birth, and the nearest neighbor, with all his intellect and noble virtues, far more deserving in every way, perishing of want and for lack of sympathy, when one sees all this, and has to turn away, helpless to relieve the undeserved suffering, one's ears ringing and heart aching with the cries of pain around him, that blessed knowledge of karma alone prevents him from cursing life and men, as well as their supposed creator. Note: objectors to the doctrine of karma should recall the fact that it is absolutely out of the question to attempt a reply to the pessimists on other data. A firm grasp of the principles of karmic law knocks away the whole basis of the imposing fabric reared by the disciples of Schopenhauer and von Hartmann. End of note. Of all the terrible blasphemies and accusations virtually thrown on their God by the monotheists, none is greater or more unpardonable than that almost always false humility, which makes the presumably pious Christian assert, in connection with every evil and undeserved blow, that such is the will of God. Dolts and hypocrites, blasphemous and impious Pharisees, who speak in the same breath of the endless merciful love and care of their God and Creator for helpless man, and of that God scourging the good, the very best of his creatures, bleeding them to death like an insatiable Moloch. Shall we be answered to this in Congreve's words, quote, "But who shall dare to tax eternal justice?" unquote. Logic and simple common sense, we answer. If we are made to believe in the original sin, in one life on this earth only for every soul, and in an anthropomorphic deity who seems to have created some men only for the pleasure of condemning them to eternal hellfire, and this whether they are good or bad, says the predestinarian, why should not every man endowed with reasoning powers condemn in his turn such a villainous deity? Note: predestinarian is the doctrine and theology of Calvinists. The purpose of God from eternity respecting all events, which becomes fatalism and kills free will or any attempt exerting it for good. It is the pre-assignment or allotment of men to everlasting happiness or misery. Catechism. A noble and encouraging doctrine this. End of note. Life would become unbearable if one had to believe in the God created by man's unclean fancy. Luckily, he exists only in human dogmas and in the unhealthy imagination of some poets who believe they have solved the problem by addressing him as "Thou great mysterious power, who hast involved the pride of human wisdom to confound the daring scrutiny and prove the faith of thy presuming creatures." Truly robust faith is required to believe that it is presumption to question the justice of one who creates helpless little man, but to perplex him, and to test a faith with which that power, moreover, may have forgotten, if not neglected, to endow him, as happens sometimes. Compare this blind faith with a philosophical belief based on every reasonable evidence and life experience in karma nemesis, or the law of retribution. This law, whether conscious or unconscious, predestines nothing and no one. It exists from and in eternity, truly, for it is eternity itself, and as much, since no act can be co-equal with eternity, it cannot be said to act, for it is action itself. It is not the wave which drowns a man, but the personal action of the wretch, who goes deliberately and places himself under the impersonal action of the laws that govern the ocean's motion. Karma creates nothing, nor does it design. It is man who plans and creates causes, and karmic law adjusts the effects, which adjustment is not an act, but universal harmony, tending ever to resume its original position. Like a bow which, bent down too forcibly, rebounds with corresponding vigor. If it happened to dislocate the arm that tried to bend it out of its natural position, shall we say that it is the bow which broke our arm, or that our own folly has brought us to grief? Karma has never sought to destroy intellectual and individual liberty like the God invented by the monotheists. It has not involved its decrees in darkness purposely to perplex man, nor shall it punish him who dares to scrutinize its mysteries. On the contrary, he who unveils through study and meditation its intricate paths, and throws light on those dark ways in the windings of which so many men perish owing to their ignorance of the labyrinth of life, is working for the good of his fellow men. Karma is an absolute and eternal law in the world of manifestation, and as there can only be one absolute as one eternal ever-present cause, Believers in karma cannot be regarded as atheists or materialists, still as fatalists. Note: some theosophists, in order to make karma more comprehensible to the Western mind, as being better acquainted with the Greek than with Aryan philosophy, have made an attempt to translate it by nemesis. Had the latter been known to the profane in antiquity, as it was understood by the initiate, this translation of the term would be unobjectionable. As it is, it has been too much anthropomorphized by Greek fancy to permit our using it without an elaborate explanation. With the early Greeks, from Homer to Herodotus, she was no goddess, but a moral feeling rather, says Descartes. The barrier to evil and immortality. He who transgresses it commits a sacrilege in the eyes of the gods, and is pursued by nemesis. But with time that feeling was defied, and its personification became an ever-fatal and punishing goddess. Therefore, if we would connect karma with nemesis, it has to be done in the triple character of the latter, meaning as nemesis, adrasteia, and themis. For while the latter is the goddess of universal order and harmony, who, like Nemesis, is commissioned to repress every excess and keep man within the limits of nature and righteousness under severe penalty, adrasteia, the inevitable, represents Nemesis as the immutable effect of causes created by man himself. Nemesis, as the daughter of decay, is the equitable goddess reserving her wrath for those alone who are maddened with pride, egoism, and impiety. In short, while Nemesis is a mythological exoteric goddess or power personified and anthropomorphized in its various aspects, karma is a highly philosophical truth, a most divine noble expression of the primitive intuition of man concerning deity. It is a doctrine which explains the origin of evil, and ennobles our conceptions of what divine immutable justice ought to be, instead of degrading the unknown and unknowable deity by making it the whimsical, cruel tyrant which we call Providence. End of note. Believers in karma cannot be regarded as atheists or materialists, still as fatalists, for karma is one with the unknowable, of which it is an aspect in its effects in the phenomenal world. Intimately, or rather indissolubly connected with karma, then, is the law of rebirth, or of the reincarnation of the same spiritual individuality in a long, almost interminable series of personalities. The latter are like the various costumes and characters played by the same actor, with each of which that actor identifies himself and is identified by the public, for the space of a few hours. The inner or real man, who personates those characters, knows the whole time that he is Hamlet for the brief space of a few acts, which represent, however, on the plane of human illusion, the whole life of Hamlet. And he knows that he was, the night before, King Lear, the transformation in his turn of the Othello of a still earlier preceding night, but the outer, visible character is supposed to be ignorant of the fact. In actual life, that ignorance is, unfortunately, but too real. Nevertheless, the permanent individuality is fully aware of the fact, though, through the atrophy of the spiritual eye in the physical body, that knowledge is unable to impress itself on the consciousness of the false personality. The possession of a physical third eye, we are told, was enjoyed by the men of the third root race down to nearly the middle point of third sub-race of the fourth root race, when the consolidation and perfection of the human frame made it disappear from the outward anatomy of man. Physically and spiritually, however, its mental and visual perceptions lasted till nearly the end of the fourth race, when its functions, owing to the materiality and depraved condition of mankind, died out altogether before the submersion of the bulk of the Atlantean continent. And now we may return to the deluges, and their many, quote, Noahs, unquote. The student has to bear in mind that there are many such deluges as mentioned in Genesis, and three far more important ones which will be mentioned and described in the section devoted to the subject of prehistoric continents. To avoid erroneous conjectures, however, with regard to the claim that the esoteric doctrine has much in it of the legends contained in the Hindu scriptures, that again the chronology of the latter is almost that of the former, only explained and made clear, and that finally the belief that Vaivasvata Manu, a generic name indeed, was the Noah of the Aryans and his prototype, all this, which is also the belief of the occultists, necessitates at this juncture a new explanation. Vidare Part 3, Submerged Continents. The primeval Manus of humanity. Those who are aware that the Great Flood, which was connected with the sinking of an entire continent, say what became a few islands, could not have happened so far back as 18 million years ago, and that Vaivasvata Manu is the Indian Noah connected with the Matsya, or the fish, avatar of Vishnu, may feel perplexed at this discrepancy between facts stated and the chronology previously given. But there is no discrepancy in truth. The reader is asked to turn to the Theosophist of July 1883, and after studying the article therein, The Septenar Principle in Esotericism, the whole question can be explained to him. It is in this explanation, I believe, that the occultists differ from the Brahmins. For the benefit of those, however, who may not have the Theosophist of that month and year to hand, a passage or two may now be quoted from it. Who was Manu, the son of Swayambhuva? The secret doctrine tells us that this Manu was no man, but the representation of the first human races evolved with the help of the Jankochans, Devas, at the beginning of the first round. But we are told in his laws, Book 1, 80, that there are 14 Manus for every kalpa, or interval from creation to creation, read interval from one minor pralaya to another, and that in the present divine age there have been as yet 7 Manus. Note, pralaya, a word already explained, is not a term that applies only to every night of Brahma, or the world's dissolution following every Manvantara, equal to 71 Mahayugas. It applies also to each obscuration as well, and even to every cataclysm that puts an end, by fire or by water in turn, to each root race. Pralaya is a term like that of Manu, the generic name for the Shistas, who, under the appellation of king, are shown in the Puranas as preserved with the seed of all things in an ark from the waters of that flood, or the fires of a general volcanic conflagration, the commencement of which we already see for our 5th race in the terrible earthquakes and eruptions of these late years, and especially in the present one, which in the season of Pralaya overspreads the world, the earth. See preface, page 81, to Wilson's Vishnu Purana. Time is only a form of Vishnu, truly, as Parasara says in that Purana. In the Hindu Yuga Kalpa, we have the regular descending series 4, 3, 2, with ciphers multiplied as occasion requires for esoteric purposes, but not, as Wilson and other Orientalists thought, for sectarian embellishments. A kalpa may be an age, a quote, day unquote, of Brahma, or a sidereal kalpa, astronomical and earthly. Those calculations are found in all the Puranas, but some differ, as for instance the year of the 7 rishis, 3030 mortal years, and the year of Dhruva, 9090 in the Linga Purana, which are again esoteric, and which do represent actual, secret chronology. As said in the Brahma Vaivata, chronologists compute a kalpa by the life of Brahma. Minor kalpas, as Samvata and the rest, are numerous. Minor kalpas denote here every period of destruction, as was well understood by Wilson himself, who explains the latter as those in which the Samvarta wind or other destructive agents operate. See Vishnu Purana, page 54, volume 1. End of note. Those who know that there are 7 rounds, of which we have passed 3 and are now in the 4th, and who are taught that there are 7 dawns and 7 twilights, or 14 manvantaras, that at the beginning of every round and at the end and on and between the planets there is an awakening to elusive life and an awakening to real life, and that, moreover, there are root manas, and what we have to clumsily translate as the seed manas, the seeds for the human races of the forthcoming round, or the Shistas, the surviving fittest, a mystery divulged only to those who have passed their third degree in initiation. Those who have learned all that will be better prepared to understand the meaning of the following. Note on the Shistas, the surviving fittest. An intuition and a presentiment of the Shistas may be found in Mr. Senner's Esoteric Buddhism, 5th edition. See in it annotations, the Noah's Ark theory, pages 146 and 147, end of note. We are told in the sacred Hindu scriptures that the first Manu produced 6 other Manus, 7 primary Manus in all, and these produced in their turn each 7 other Manus. Brigu 1, 61-63, the production of the latter standing in the occult treatises as 7 by 7. Note, the fact that Manu himself is made to declare that he was created by Viraj, and that he then produced the 10 Prajapatis, who again produced 7 Manus, who in their turn gave birth to 7 other Manus, Manu 1, 33-36, relates to other, still earlier mysteries, and is at the same time a blind with regard to the doctrine of the septenary chain and the simultaneous evolution of 7 humanities, or men. However, the present work is written on the records of Chetamalian secret teachings, and Brahmanical esoteric philosophy may now differ in form, as the Kabbalah does, but they were identical in hoary antiquity. End of note. Thus it becomes clear that Manu, the last one, the progenitor of our 4th round humanity, must be the 7th, since we are on our 4th round, and there is a root Manu at globe A and a seed Manu at globe G. Note, there is another esoteric reason besides this one for it. A Vaivashvata is the 7th Manu, because this our round, although the 4th, is in the pre-septenary Manvantara, and the round itself is in its 7th stage of materiality or physicality. The close of its middle racial point occurred during the 4th root race, when man and all nature reached their lowest state of gross matter. From that time, that is, from the end of the 3.5 races, humanity and nature entered on the ascending arc of their racial cycle. End of note. Just as each planetary round commences with the appearance of a root Manu, Diankohan, and closes with a seed Manu, so a root and a seed Manu appear respectively at the beginning and the termination of the human period on any particular planet. Note, the interval that precedes each yuga is called a sandhya, composed of as many hundreds of years as there are thousands in the yuga, and that which follows the latter is named sandhyamsa, and is of similar duration, we are told in Vishnu Purana. The interval between the sandhya and the sandhyamsa is the yuga denominated krita, treta, etc., etc. The 4 krita, treta, dvapara, and kali constitute a great age, or aggregate of 4 ages. 1,000 such aggregates are a day of Brahma, and 14 Manus reign within that term. Now, had we to accept this literally, then there would be only 1 Manu for every 4,320,000,000 of years, as we are taught that it took 300 million of years for the 2 lower kingdoms to evolve, and that our humanity is just 18 and some odd millions old. Where were the other Manus spoken of, unless the allegory means what the esoteric doctrine teaches us about the 14 being each multiplied by 49? End of note. It will be easily seen from the foregoing statement that Manu anteric period means, as the term implies, the time between the appearance of 2 Manus or Diankohans, and hence a minor Manvantara is the duration of the 7 races on any particular planet, and a major Manvantara is the period of 1 human round along the planetary chain. Moreover, that, as it is said that each of the 7 Manus creates 7 by 7 Manus, and that there are 49 root races on the 7 planets during each round, then every root race has its Manu. The present 7th Manu is called Vaivashvata, and stands in the exoteric texts for that Manu who represents in India the Babylonian Chisutrus and the Jewish Noah. But in the esoteric books we are told that Manu Vaivashvata, the progenitor of our fifth race, who saved it from the flood that nearly exterminated the fourth Atlantis, is not the seventh Manu mentioned in the nomenclature of the root or primitive Manus, or the 49 Manus emanated from this root Manu. For clear comprehension, we here give the names of the 14 Manus in their respective order and relation to each round. First round is the first root Manu on planet A, Swayambhuva. First seed Manu on planet G, Svaroki or Svarotisha. Second round, root Manu on planet A, Uttama. Second seed Manu on planet G, Tamasa. And third round is the third root Manu on planet A, Raivata. Third seed Manu on planet G, Chakkuska. Fourth round, fourth root Manu on planet A, Vaivashvata, our progenitor. Fourth seed Manu on planet G, Savarna. Fifth round, fifth root Manu on planet A, Daksha Savarna. Fifth seed Manu on planet G, Brahma Savarna. Sixth round, sixth root Manu on planet A, Dharma Savarna. Sixth seed Manu on planet G, Rudra Sarvana. Seventh round, seventh root Manu on planet A, Ukya. Seventh seed Manu on planet G, Botya. Vaivashvata thus, though seventh in the order given, is the primitive root Manu of our fourth human wave. The reader must always remember that Manu is not a man, but a collective humanity. While our Vaivashvata was but one of the 7 minor Manus who are made to preside over the 7 races of this our planet. Each of these has to become the witness of one of the periodical and ever-recurring cataclysms, by fire and water, that close the cycle of every root race. And it is this Vaivashvata, the Hindu ideal embodiment, called respectively Xisutrus, Deucalion, Noah, and by other names, who is the allegorical man who rescued our race, when nearly the whole population of one hemisphere perished by water, while the other hemisphere was awakening from its temporary obscuration. Note: the words creation, dissolution, etc. do not render correctly the right meaning of either Manvantara or Pralaya. The Vishnu Purana enumerates several. The dissolution of all things is of 4 kinds, Parasara is made to say. Naimitika, occasional, when Brahma slumbers, his night when at the end of this day occurs a recoalescence of the universe, called Brahma's contingent recoalescence, because Brahma is this universe itself. Prakritika, elemental, when the return of this universe to its original nature is partial and physical. Atyantika, absolute, identification of the embodied with the incorporeal Supreme Spirit, Mahatmic state, whether temporary or until the following Mahakalpa. Also absolute obscuration, as of a whole planetary chain, etc. And Nitya, perpetual Mahapralaya for the universe, death for man. Nitya is the extinction of life, like the extinction of a lamp, also in sleep at night. Nitya Sarga is constant or perpetual creation, as Nitya Pralaya is constant or perpetual destruction of all that is born. That which ensues after minor dissolution is called ephemeral creation. This is Samyama, production, existence, and dissolution. Vishnu Purana, Book 1, Chapter 7. The subject is so difficult that we are obliged to repeat our statements. End of note. Thus it is shown that there is no real discrepancy in speaking of the Vaivashvata Manvantara, Manu Antara, literally between 2 Manus, 18 million odd years ago, when physical or the truly human man first appeared in his 4th round on this earth, and of the other Vaivashvatas, for example the Manu of the great cosmic or sidereal flood, a mystery, or again the Manu Vaivashvata of the submerged Atlantis, when the racial Vaivasvata saved the elect of humanity, the fifth race, from utter destruction. As the several and quite different events are purposely blended in the Vishnu and other Puranas in one narrative, there may yet be a great deal of perplexity left in the profane reader's mind. Therefore, as constant elucidation is needed, we must be forgiven unavoidable repetitions. The blinds which conceal the real mysteries of esoteric philosophy are great and puzzling, and even now the last word cannot be given. The veil, however, may be a little more removed, and some explanations hitherto denied may now be offered to the earnest student. As somebody, Colonel Vance Kennedy, if we do not mistake, remarked, the first principle in Hindu religious philosophy is unity in diversity. If all those Manus and Rishis are called by one generic name, this is due to the fact that they are, one and all, the manifested energies of one and the same Logos, the celestial as well as the terrestrial messengers and permutations of that principle which is ever in a state of activity, conscious during the period of cosmic evolution, unconscious from our point of view during cosmic rest, as the Logos sleepeth in the bosom of that which sleepeth not, nor is it ever awake, for it is sat or beingness, not a being. It is from it that issues the great unseen Logos, who evolves all the other Logoi, the primeval Manu, who gives being to the other Manus, who emanate the universe and all in it collectively, and who represent in their aggregate the manifested Logos. Note, but see the superb definitions of Parabrahmam and the Logos in Mr. Subaro's lectures on the Bhagavad Gita in the early numbers of the Theosophist of 1887, February, March, April, and May. End of note. Hence we learn in the commentaries that while no Dhyan, not even the highest, can realize completely the condition of the preceding cosmic evolution, the Manus retain a knowledge of their experiences of all the cosmic evolutions throughout eternity. This is very plain. The first Manu is called Swayambhuva, the self-manifested, the son of the unmanifested Father. The Manus are the creators of our first race, the spirit of mankind, which does not prevent the seven Manus from having been the first pre-Adamic men on earth. Manu declares himself created by Viraj, or Vaishvanara, the spirit of humanity, which means that his monad emanates from the never-resting principle in the beginning of every new cosmic activity, that Logos or universal monad, collective Elohim, that radiates from within himself all those cosmic monads that become the centers of activity, progenitors of the numberless solar systems, as well as of the yet undifferentiated human monads of planetary chains, as well as of every being thereon. Notes. See preceding footnote, and see Manu 1, 32 and 33. Vaishvanara is, in another sense, the living magnetic fire that pervades the manifested solar system. It is the most objective, to us the reverse, and ever-present aspect of the one life, for it is the vital principle. See Theosophist, July 1883, page 249. It is also a name of Agni. End of note. Each cosmic monad is Swayambhuva, the self-born, which becomes the center of force, from within which emerges a planetary chain, of which chains there are 7 in our system, and whose radiations become again so many Manus, Swayambhuva, a generic name mysterious in meaning far more than appears, each of these becoming as a host, the creator of his own humanity. See the Manus and the Manvantaras explained by a Western mystic and mathematician. As to the question of the 4 distinct races of mankind that preceded our 5th race, there is nothing mystical in it except the ethereal bodies of the first races, and it is a matter of a legendary, nevertheless very correct history. That legend is universal, and if the Western savant pleases to see in it only a myth, it does not make the slightest difference. The Mexicans had, and still have, the tradition of the fourfold destruction of the world by fire and water, just as the Egyptians had, and the Hindus have to this day. trying to account for the community of legends in the remote antiquity held by Chinese, Chaldean, Egyptians, Indians, and Greeks, and for the absence of any certain vestige of civilization more ancient than 5,000 years, the author of Mythical Monsters remarks that we must not be surprised if we do not immediately discover the vestiges of the people of 10, 15, or 20,000 years ago. With an ephemeral architecture, as in China, the sites of vast cities may have become entirely lost to recollection in a few thousands of years from natural decay. And how much more if minor cataclysms have intervened, such as local inundations, earthquakes, deposition of volcanic ashes, the spread of sandy deserts, destruction of life by deadly pestilence, by miasma, by the outpour of sulphurous fumes. From Mystical Monsters by Charles Gould, page 134. And how many of such cataclysms have changed the whole surface of the earth may be inferred from this stanza. Quote, during the first 7 Kuras of the Kalpa, 70 million years, the earth and its 2 kingdoms, mineral and vegetable, one already having achieved its 7th circle, the other hardly nascent, are luminous and semi-ethereal, cold, lifeless, and translucid. In the 11th crore, the Mother Earth grows opaque, and in the 14th the throes of adolescence take place. These convulsions of nature, geological changes, last till her 20th crore of years, uninterruptedly, after which they become periodical, and at long intervals." Unquote. The last change took place nearly 12 crores of years ago, 120 million. But the earth, with everything on her face, had become cool, hard, and settled ages earlier. Commentary 22. Note on the 11th crore. This in the period of secondary creation, so-called. Of the primary, when earth is in possession of the 3 elemental kingdoms, we cannot speak for several reasons. Unless one is a great seer or naturally intuitional, he will be unable to realize that which can never be expressed in any existing terms. End of note. Note on the 14th crore. Hippocrates said that the number 7, by its occult virtues, tended to the accomplishment of all things, to be the dispenser of life and fountain of all its changes. The life of man he divided into 7 ages. Shakespeare. For as the moon changes her phases every 7 days, this number influences all sublunary beings, and even the earth, as we know. With the child, it is the teeth that appear in the 7th month, and he sheds them at 7 years. At twice 7 puberty begins. At 3 times 7 all our mental and vital powers are developed. At 4 times 7 he is in his full strength. At 5 times 7 his passions are most developed, etc., etc. Thus for the earth, it is now in its middle age, yet very little wiser for it. The tetragrammaton, the 4-lettered sacred name of the deity, can be resolved on earth only by becoming septenary through the manifest triangle proceeding from the concealed tetractys. Therefore, the number 7 has to be adopted on this plane. As written in the Kabbalah, the Greater Holy Assembly, verse 1161, "For assuredly there is no stability in those 6, save what they derive from the 7th. For all things depend from the 7th. End of note. Thus, if we are to believe esoteric teaching, there have been no more universal geological disturbances and changes for the last 120 millions of years, and the earth was, even before that time, ready to receive a human stock. The appearance of the latter, however, in its full physical development, as already stated, took place only about 18 millions of years ago, after the first great failure of nature to create beings alone, without the help of the divine fashioners, had been followed by the successive evolution of the first 3 races. See above stanza 3 its sequence. The actual duration of the first 2.5 races is withheld from all but the high initiates. The history of the races begins at the separation of the sexes, when the preceding egg-bearing androgynous race perished rapidly, and the subsequent sub-races of the third root race appeared as an entirely new race physiologically. It is this, quote, destruction, unquote, which is called allegorically the Great Vaivashvata Manu deluge, when the account shows Vaivashvata Manu, or humanity, remaining alone on earth in the ark of salvation, towed by Vishnu in the shape of a monstrous fish, and the 7 rishis with him. The allegory is very plain. In the symbolism of every nation, the deluge stands for chaotic unsettled matter, chaos itself, and the water for the feminine principle, the great deep. As the Greek lexicon of Parkhurst gives it, ark answers to the Hebrew rasit, or wisdom, and at the same time to the emblem of the female generative power, the arg, or arka, in which the germ of nature and of mankind floats or broods on the great abyss of the waters, during the interval which takes place after every mundane or racial cycle. Ark is also the mystic name of the divine spirit of life, which broods over chaos. Now Vishnu is the divine spirit as an abstract principle, and also as the preserver and generator or giver of life, the third person of the Trimurti, composed of Brahma, the creator, Shiva, the destroyer, and Vishnu, the preserver. Vishnu is shown in the allegory as guiding, under the form of a fish, the ark of Vaivashvata Manu clean across the waters of the flood. There is no use in expatiating upon the esoteric meaning of the word fish. See Pain Knight, Inman, Gerald Massey, etc. Its theological meaning is phallic, but the metaphysical is divine. Jesus is called the fish, and so are Vishnu and Bacchus, Ins, the saviour of mankind, being but the monogram of the god Bacchus, called Ichux, called the fish. Note, says Saint Augustine of Jesus, for he is a fish that lives in the midst of waters. Christians call themselves little fishes, pisciculi, in their sacred mysteries. So many fishes bred in the water and saved by one great fish, says Tertullian of the Christians and Christ and the Church. End of note. As to the 7 rishis in the ark, they symbolized the 7 principles which became complete in man only after he had separated and become a human and no longer a divine creature. See for further details the 7th Manu. Nor have we many details about the submersion of the continent inhabited by the 2nd root race. But the history of the 3rd Lemuria is given, as is that of Atlantis, the others being only alluded to. Lemuria is said to have perished about 700,000 years before the commencement of what is now called the Tertiary Age, the Eocene. And it is during this deluge also, an actual geological deluge this time, that Vaivashvata Manu is again shown as saving mankind. Allegorically, it is mankind, or a portion of it, the 4th race, which is saved. So also he saves the 5th race during the destruction of the last Atlanteans, the remnant that perished 850,000 years ago, after which there was no great submersion until the day of Plato's Atlantis, or Poseidonis, known to the Egyptians only because it happened in such relatively recent times. Note on 150,000 years ago. This event, the destruction of the famous island of Ruta and the smaller one, Daitya, which occurred 850,000 years ago in the later Pliocene times, must not be confounded with the submersion of the main continent of Atlantis during the Miocene period. Geologists cannot place the Miocene only so short a way back as 850,000 years. Whatever they do, it is several million years ago that the main Atlantis perished. End of note. It is the submersion of the great Atlantis which is the most interesting. It is of this cataclysm that the old records, see the Book of Enoch, say that the ends of the earth got loose, and upon which the legends and allegories of Vaivashvata, Xisutrus, Noah, Deucalion, and all the tutti quanti of the elect saved have been built. Tradition, taking into no account the difference between sidereal and geological phenomena, calls both indifferently deluges. Yet there is a great difference. The cataclysm which destroyed the huge continent of which Australia is the largest relic was due to a series of subterranean convulsions and the breaking asunder of the ocean floors. That which put an end to its successor, the fourth continent, was brought on by successive disturbances in the axial rotation. It began during the earliest tertiary periods and, continuing for long ages, carried away successively the last vestige of Atlantis, with the exception perhaps of Ceylon and a small portion of what is now Africa. It changed the face of the globe, and no memory of its flourishing continents and isles, of its civilization and sciences, remained in the annals of history, save in the sacred records of the East. Hence modern science denies Atlantis and its existence. It even denies any violent shiftings of the Earth's axis, and would attribute the reason for the change of climates to other causes. But this question is still an open one. If Dr. Crowell will have it that all such alterations can be accounted for by the effects of nutation and the precession of the equinoxes, there are other men of science, such as Sir H. James, Athenaeum, August 25, 1860, and Sir John Lubbock, the same source, who feel more inclined to accept the idea that they are due to a change in the position of the axis of rotation. Against this, the majority of astronomers are again arrayed. But then, what have they not denied before now, and what have they not denounced, only to accept it later on, whenever the hypothesis became undeniable fact? How far our figures agree, or rather disagree, with modern science will be seen further in the addenda to this book, where the geology and anthropology of our modern day are carefully compared with the same in archaic science. At any rate, the period assigned in the secret doctrine for the sinking of Atlantis does not seem to disagree very much with the calculations of modern science, which calls Atlantis Lemuria, however, whenever it accepts such a submerged continent. With regard to the pre-human period, all that can be said at present is that even up to the appearance of the mindless first race, the earth was not without its inhabitants. More may be said. That which science, recognizing only physical man, has a right to regard as the pre-human period may be conceded to have extended from the first race down to the first half of the Atlantean race, since it is only then that man became the complete organic being he is now. And this would make Adamic man no older than a few million of years. Note: Mr. Huxley divides those races into the quintuple group of Australoids, Negroids, Mongoloids, Xanthocroics, and Melanocroics, all issuing from imaginary anthropoids. And yet, while protesting against those who say that the structural differences between man and apes are small and insignificant, and adding that every bone of the gorilla bears a mark by which it can be distinguished from a corresponding human bone, and that, in the present state of creation at least, no intermediary being fills the gap which separates the man from the troglodyte. The great anatomist goes on speaking of the simian characteristics in man. See the Cataclysms, the human species, page 113. End of note. The author of the Kabbalah remarks truly that man today, as an individual, is only a concatenation of the beinghood of precedent human life, or lives, rather. According to the Kabbalah, the soul sparks contained in Adam, Rishon, went into three principal classes corresponding to his three sons, meaning Hesed, Habel, Geborah, Qayin, and Ramin, Seth. These three were divided into 70 species, called the principal roots of the human race. Unquote from page 422. Quote, said Rabbi Yehuda, "How many garments of the incorporeal man are these which are crowned from the day man was created?" Said Elazar, "The mountains of the world, the great men of the generation, are in discussion upon it, but there are three, one to clothe in that garment the Ruach spirit, which is in the Garden of Eden on earth, one which is more precious than all, in which the Neshama is clothed in that bundle of life between the angels of the kings, and one outside garment, which exists and does not exist, is seen and not seen. In that garment the Nephesh is clothed, and she goes and flies in it, to and fro in the world." Unquote from Zohar 1, 119b, 475, Kabbalah 412. This relates to the races, their, quote, garments, unquote, or degree of materiality, and to the three principles of man in their three vehicles. Next chapter is stanza 11. The civilization and destruction of the fourth and fifth races.